Our gospel lesson comes to us today from Matthew chapter 17 in verses 1 through 9. Friends, as I always do, I invite you to listen for God's word to you. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and brought them to the top of a very high mountain. He was transformed in front of them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Moses and Elijah appeared to him, talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus, "Lord, it's good that we are here. If you want, I'll make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was speaking, look, a bright cloud overshadowed them. A voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I dearly love. I am very pleased with him. Listen to him." Hearing this, the disciples fell on their faces, filled with awe. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Don't tell anybody about the vision until the human one is raised from the dead." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Welcome to Transfiguration Sunday, the end of our season of Epiphany. So you can take down your Christmas trees now if you've not done so already. Lent is nigh. This Wednesday already somehow is Ash Wednesday. So come on back here at 7 as I plugged earlier for some commemoration, some worship, and some imposition of ashes. And as that's the start of our 40-day period of penitence and reconciliation, if you're into the whole eating pancakes and sausages on Tuesday, just wolf down as many as you can then, because then, 40 days of fasting. But we'll talk about all that stuff next week. Liturgically speaking, today is the end of the season of Epiphany. And it bookends that season with another story, the baptism of the Lord. Now, you might remember that in both of these Epiphany texts, right, both of these texts of metamorphosis, if you will, there's some commonality. You might remember that in both there's a cloud and a voice from on high that says, "This is my son whom I dearly love." One, however, was down in the Jordan River Valley, and one, of course, was up on this mountain. And of course, now there's the added instruction to listen to him. So that's a little different. But as I was mentioning just a few minutes ago, I think this is where we get that idea of a mountaintop experience. Right? For this experience that happened on a mountaintop was certainly one that they would have wanted to write home about. And as I sort of prepped you for a little bit earlier, I'm interested if you all have ever had any of those mountaintop experiences in your life. I have. One that I talked about a little bit during my Epiphany sermon. Now, of course, these mountaintop experiences don't have to actually happen on literal mountaintops. Right? They can be any myriad of experiences that deepen our sense of faith, our sense of closeness to God and to one another, and that fill us with that wonderful sense of awe and mystery. These are the sorts of experiences that one might either write home about or hold on to and keep close to your heart. So again, I invite you to think back on those things that may have happened in your life, whatever they might have looked like to you. Maybe it was the birth of a child. Maybe it was like being in a place like no other. And again, if you can't think of anything off the bat still, even though I've given you more than enough time for this assignment, then I imagine you to think about what it must have been like for Peter and for John and for James, who were up there on that mountain with Jesus to experience what they did. mountaintop experiences. And there are also, I might add, mountaintop experiences. And I'm curious as to whether or not you've had any of those as well. As a good Northwest kid who is really into hiking but not so much climbing, I've only had a relative few, but few enough that I can think back on all of them, and they all fill me with joy. So, for instance, while I've been on the mountain, known to you non-Cascadians as Rainier or Tahoma, I've never been to the top of that. So I've never, like my dad has almost, I've not climbed it. But I have been on sort of the top of a handful of mountains. My earliest was actually when I was about Audrey's age, up to the top of Sundance Mountain in the Idaho Selkirks, a mere 6,300 feet. And I think most of that was probably on my dad's back as opposed to hiking that one myself. But, we can take whatever help we can get, right? And that was bookended also with my parents and my sister by my most recent experience, this time up in the BC Selkirks, to the top of Mount Revelstoke, just a quaint little 6360. And in the middle of those experiences are some trips to a mountain called Lookout, which is 67-something, and a couple other little things like that. I'm not going to count skiing because riding a chairlift isn't quite the same as doing a little hiking up that high, but still beautiful and wonderful. The highest I've ever been, just as an aside while I'm going off of this, is a place in the Swiss Alps called the Jungfraujoch, which is a saddle in between two majestic peaks. But that doesn't really count because you can take a train to get there. But still, taking a train to a station that's at 11,322 feet is kind of spectacular in and of itself. But the most impressive experience I have had on a mountaintop was back in my old scouting days. And it's the top of this mountain called the Eagle Cap, deep in the wilderness in the Wallowas in Oregon. And it's a chilly and, depending on what kind of shape you're in, a very breathtaking 95-77 feet. And the views from up there are impressive. There's this valley below with glacial lakes and trees, lots of rocks and ice, and then snow-capped peaks. If you're lucky, you might even see an eagle, for which the area is named, flying by or perhaps even underneath you. And it's one of those places that just fills you with awe and wonder as you're up there. And you're standing on these rocks, and there's a rush of wind that comes up that makes you sort of hope that your footing is perhaps more steady than you might give it credit for. And there's the smells. The smell of trees coming off of the wind, that truly fresh mountain air. The smell of perhaps you and your friends after such a hike of 2,000 feet up of switchbacks with a heavy pack on. It's one of those great life experiences that I will always carry with me, and that I was privileged to have as just a wee high schooler who could barely hold on to a 40-pound pack on my back while spending a week in a beautiful wilderness. And in our text this morning, we hear about the mountaintop experience that these disciples, Peter, John, and James, and of course Jesus himself, experienced. And I wonder if before this sort of mystical experience that they have, if they had a chance to really take it all in too when they got to the top. Did they feel the breeze? Did they worry about their footing? Far from the leather boots and wool socks I was wearing, they would have just had sandals. Were they afraid of heights? Remember, these guys are all fishermen. They're not really used to being up high. Was that something that would have filled them with awe or perhaps a bit of fright? And then in the midst of all of that, as they're taking this all in, something happened to them. And as they looked on, Jesus changed. And his face becomes like the sun, and his clothes become as white as that light I shouldn't be staring into, but just totally did. So give me a sec while I adjust. And here they are on this mountaintop in the midst of all that. Imagine this, taking this all in, right? Now, what we don't know, because we've skipped around Matthew in the lectionary, is that just before this, Jesus tells them that the reason why we're going to Jerusalem is that I'm going to die. So they're trying to figure out what on earth that means. And then Jesus just sort of says, hey, let's go for a hike, right? That's where they're at in their heads, in the midst of experience this. Taking it all in that he, the Messiah, the one from the line of David who was going to save them, God with them, the very Son of God, the very human one himself, was going to die. And then he invites them on this little hike, and then he is changed. But not only that, for with him appear these two great heroes of the faith, Moses, the liberator himself, and Elijah, the great prophet. Now, what could be going through the minds of these witnesses as they see all of this? We will, of course, never know. And what could be going through Jesus' mind likewise? We also can't know. Did he know that this would happen? Was he prepared for an experience like this? Did he know that God was going to do this thing for him and his disciples there? Right? Was he prepared for sort of dad to give him this big pep talk? Or did he just have a sense, a nudge? Did he wake up that morning and think, you know what? This feels like a good day for a hike. Hey guys, grab your sandals. I'm kind of feeling it today. And I wonder if anyone there standing atop of that mountain remembered that Moses once was called to the top of a very high mountain, Mount Sinai, standing at a cool 7497, when a bright cloud overshadowed him. And he radiated from being in God's presence and returned later to the people carrying those 10 words, that covenant between the people and God. And did any of them there, as they see all this, remember the story of Elijah? And at the end of Elijah's life, Elijah doesn't die. He gets taken away by God on a chariot of fire in an experience that we could only describe as being kidnapped by a UFO, as he leaves earth in this most spectacular and perplexing way. And I wonder, were these things all happening for the benefit of Jesus, giving him hope and courage as he faces his own end, reminding him of who he is and what he was sent to do and what he was called to experience? Or were they there for the benefit of these three leaders of disciples, helping them to understand that Jesus, like Moses, is the great interpreter of the law for his people, and that Jesus, like Elijah, will pass away in a most spectacular and perplexing way, dying on that Roman instrument of death and humiliation. And in the middle of all of that, Peter reacts in the way that he knows how. Let's build some booths or structures or tents or shrines, depending on your interpretation of the Greek there. I've heard it said that in the middle of a crisis or a trauma, or really anything that we experience that's truly beyond us, we don't rise to the occasion. We fall back on what we know. We go back to our training. And so Peter also, in the midst of maybe remembering the story of Moses, thinks that, well, maybe this conference is going to take a while. Remember, Moses was up on that mountain for quite a while, and so we should do something to get out of the weather. I mean, there's this big cloud here, right? It's only hospitable. Might be nice if the rain starts up. I mean, we don't know what Peter was thinking, right? Maybe he wasn't. I don't know about you, but if I experienced that, I don't know if I'd really be able to sit back and reflect on that experience as it's happening. I don't think I'm quite that sort of person. Maybe a sort of person who'd be like, your mileage may vary. Right? If you were there with Jesus on the top of this mountain, and suddenly he just transforms into something else, glowing as if he's been hanging out with a little bit too much uranium, almost as if he wasn't human anymore. This was some heavy stuff that they were experiencing and seeing here. And what would you do if you found yourself in the middle of this mountaintop experience? And then if all of that isn't enough for them, here comes this voice from the cloud. just like the crowds gathered at the baptism of Jesus heard. And this cloud says, "This is my Son whom I dearly love. I am very pleased with him." And the voice adds, "Listen to him." And that's just all too much, isn't it? And the disciples react following their training as one is supposed to do when one encounters God's presence. They fall on their faces, filled with awe. That seems to be, by the way, in case you should ever come across something similar, how one is supposed to properly react to the divine presence. Not only for reverence, but really for safety. The reason, and that also occurs, by the way, if you encounter an angel. We sort of miss this with our cultural sort of understandings of how pretty angels are and all this other stuff, and those cutesy little babies with the wings. But that's Italian Renaissance art. If you actually look at how the Bible describes these divine beings, that's some scary stuff there. 6-winged dragons that breathe fire, that look like snakes. Floating wheels of eyes. And the worst, perhaps, is the cherubim themselves. These are not cutesy. Has anyone ever been to the Oriental Institute on the UI or the U Chicago campus? If you go there, you'll encounter this wall that's maybe yay big, and there's a sculpture that fills this space. And it looks like a thing with the head of a dude with a really cool hat and a great beard and the body of a lion. That is what a cherub was in the imagination of the people of Israel. It could destroy you with a look. Of course you're going to be afraid. And then there's the divine presence itself, right? We learn from Moses that if you look directly at God in person, you will not survive that encounter. Moses is literally burned, irradiated from being close to God. These are scary things because, think about it. God created everything, right? The universe, universes, black holes, planets, suns, grains of sand, spiders and snakes, viruses, everything. Ticks. Trying to imagine what God actually looks like is certainly something that's beyond what I could do. God is so big that we theologians like to refer to God as being transcendent, right? God is beyond us. God is other with a capital O. But God is just other to us in the way that if we create something, we are other to that. So if you write fiction, right, or if you play a game like The Sims or Minecraft or something, you create this world, but you are not of the world itself, right? That's kind of one way to sort of imagine the difference and the distance between ourselves and God. And on this mountaintop, Jesus and Peter and John and James have this glimpse of divinity. Jesus has changed, but so are the disciples. And precisely here, in the midst of their awe and their confusion and this wonderful view and probably their fear, that God shows us God's true self. For we who follow Christ recognize that what these disciples in this moment have inscribed deep into their lives in this experience, that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us, that the one who is truly other to us, beyond our reckoning, frightening, perhaps even destructive in terms of scope and power, can be known in this one person, in this son of Mary and Joe, in this dear friend who invites us up for a hike one nice morning. This one, in whom God can be known in sort of a thing that theologians like to call immanence, where God sort of is present among us, where God's love permeates us. In the touch that calls us back onto our feet, that calms our fears. In those soothing words, "Don't be afraid." In that knowing look from someone who truly and deeply loves us. What had started out as the ordinary, just to hike up a mountain with a little cloud up there on the summit, turned into the extraordinary. a friend transformed, heroes from the past joining in some sort of mysterious and mystical experience that we cannot understand, the very voice of God itself. And then, in the midst of what must have been quite a hike back, Jesus warns them not to talk about it until he's dead. Imagine what that must have been like. Our story this morning is utterly extraordinary. And perhaps for us in such a different time and place, where truth is usually measured in empirical fact, unless we're sort of into YouTube and think that the earth is flat again and all that kind of stuff. I think it's a little harder for us to understand about these great mystical experiences. Experiences like that were written from the perspective of those who believed that they had actually happened. But I think it helps if we remember that when one's ordinary becomes extraordinary, when we have those mountaintop experiences in our lives, when one wanders into a thin place, well, those are the things that really change us. And as we look upon those experiences later in our lives, we interpret those experiences in light of what has happened since. I know I have done that with that theophany I had 15 years ago. And as we're sort of looking upon this maybe with skeptical eyes, we should remember that Matthew, written around 85 CE, a good 50 years after the events that the gospel is narrating, right? That would be us looking back to 1970 and writing about that. So not that long ago for some of us. But in the 21st century, right, with our antibiotics and our hand washing and our gym memberships and our access to safe food and water, that's not that long of a time in a person's life. But for poor folk in the first century, well, most likely those who were there with Jesus, who remembered him, with any exception but some of the children, were probably not around to tell the story anymore. And so we get this strange story, told a generation after the experience of these three guys who had just gone for an ordinary hike that had turned quite extraordinary, remembered and told that story in light of who they had experienced Jesus to be. For Jesus was God with us. He was the imminent inbreaking of God and God's love into our world in a way that was so real that you could be invited out for a hike and then experience something entirely other, surrounded by the heroes of your tradition and becoming enveloped by God's voice. And all of that happened in the middle of this great upheaval for them. He had told them he was just about to die. Not long after the story, their journey to Jerusalem ends at a table and a trial and a cross and an empty tomb. And then, of course, the disciples go on from there, living their lives and their faith in the midst of an empire that certainly did not welcome them. We know from history and tradition that each one of them would die a martyr. But for them, this experience, as unexplicable as it was in the moment, was a gift. And like with Jesus, it prepared them for what would come by reminding them precisely who Jesus was and that he was there for them. Don't be afraid, he tells them as he puts his hand on their shoulder. Just like he does for us here and now. When the waters rise too far, when the diagnosis is bad, when we receive a final notice, when the phone rings a little too late at night, when violence strikes, and when hope fades. Jesus is there. The Jesus who hikes up the mountain with us, the God who is with us, who is God's Son, who tells us to not be afraid, who will never give up on us, who bids us to strive on, even though it feels like he is so very far away, inviting us to be his body for one another and for all of our neighbors. especially in such a time as this. Amen.